Mythology is generally a collection of myths of a group of people. These stories explain nature, history, and customs, but are generally believed to not be true. Folklore is generally a collection of traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. Legends are stories coming down from the past, but they're not verifiable. They may or may not be considered historical. In the past, the human race relied on these types of stories to live their life and to explain the world around them. Nowadays, myths, legends, and folklore have all been replaced by religion. Most of these religions are Semitic, originating out of the Middle East and forced upon people through violence. As you can see from this map, that was from Wikipedia Commons, uploader LightTK21. The majority of the Americas is Christian. Half of Africa and all of Europe is mainly Christian. The upper half of Africa and the Middle East is Islamic. India is Hindu. Chinese and South Asia has quite a bit of Buddhism. Australia is Christian, and the Indonesia area is Muslim, and a very small pocket is Judaic. All of these three religions, along with Hinduism and Buddhism, compete. But where did these religions come from? As I said, they were forced upon people through acts of war and violence, and forced the people to submit to these belief systems. Well, the answer to where these religions came from comes from ancient books that have survived and were not burnt or destroyed. Buddhism is easily traceable to a man named Siddhartha Gautama. Now, this Gautama is simply referred to as the Buddha, although there have been multiple Buddhas. He taught a religion based on the middle way between sensual indulgence and the severe asceticism. He is the primary figure in Buddhism, and he is recognized as enlightened or divine. It is thought that he lived perhaps 2,500 years ago. Hinduism is very ancient as well, and there are many versions of it. It is a polytheistic religion consisting of many gods and goddesses. Each god and goddess has their own cult and symbols and teachings and so forth. Both Hinduism and Buddhism are followed by millions of people. Now, going back to some of the other main Semitic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they come from a common source, and this common source came out of the Middle East, and it started off with Judaism, which morphed into Christianity, which morphed into Islam. Now, you could say also that there were offshoots of this Semitic religion, such as Mormonism, and I would even include Satanism as part of an offshoot of the Semitic cult. But where did these religions come from? And where did Hinduism come from? Who is this main god and Satan of Semitic religion, and who are the gods and goddesses of Hinduism? After many years of study, I believe I have found the answers in several ancient esoteric libraries out of Harvard University and the British Library, as well as other esoteric sources. What I have found, I term the hidden human story, and I have proven out through many of my books and online blogs and videos that the identity of the Semitic god is the Greek Zeus. However, it is a cult, and therefore inside this cult are other aspects of worship for other gods and goddesses, mainly including Cronus, the Greek god Cronus. What I found through these books in these libraries is that a group of people lived probably over 15,000 years ago, and they created agricultural cults. They came out of ancient Tyre, ancient Crete, ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon. They traveled all over the world. They set up genetic royal houses. They fought amongst themselves. But in the end, one main group won out, and that would be the bloodline of Zeus. Even though there were other bloodlines of relatives of these Cronites competing, their cults have been forced underground. And this unnameable Semitic god, some call Jehovah, or whatever names you have, has had his identity hidden for over 2,000 years, roughly. The proof comes from the ancient writings of ancient Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Nordic, Celtic, and Hindu scholars. A good place to start would be in the book written by Valerius Maximus. Here is what he wrote. In his book, Memorable Deeds and Sayings, 1,000 Tales from Ancient Rome, he wrote, "The Jews had tried to corrupt Roman values with their cult of Jupiter Sabazius, so the praetor forced them to go back to their home. Cornelius Hispanus expelled the Chaldeans from the city and ordered them to leave Italy within 10 days to prevent them from making money out of their foreign science. The Jews had tried to pass their religion on to the Romans, so Hispanus expelled them from the city and demolished their private altars in the public places. The Senate decided that the temples of Isis and Serapis should be demolished, but none of the workers dared to touch the temples. The consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus took off his official striped toga, grabbed an axe, and smashed in the doors of the temple." Now, these words were written over 2,000 years ago by Valerius Maximus. The cult of Jupiter Sabazius is further exposed by artwork at the British Museum, as well as other pieces of artwork that expose the identity of who Jupiter Sabazius is. At the British Museum online, there is a stone relief entitled Zeus Sabazius, showing a white-bearded man on a horse approaching a tree with an eagle at the top and a snake around the tree. These steles and other artwork depicting Zeus Sabazius, or Zeus, or Jupiter, were common in the ancient world over 2,000 years ago. It was well known who the god of the Jews was, or rather, what their cult was about. But as I said, it is not strictly a cult based on Zeus. It has elements of Cronus worship, Dionysus worship, Prometheus worship, Ashtaroth worship, and so on. Now, as I had mentioned, there was a library out of Harvard University entitled the Loeb Library. The Loeb Library was sponsored and created by a Jewish German-American banker philanthropist named James Loeb, born in 1867, and he died in 1933. Today, that library consists of over 500 books from ancient Greek and Roman scholars. After looking thoroughly through this library and its catalog, I was able to pinpoint the books that I knew would tell the story of what had happened in the past. It was in the writings of the ancient Greek, Roman, and Egyptian scholars Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, Hesiod, Homer, Manetho, Valerius Maximus, Macrobius, and many others that the story began to unfold with a timeline. And as I said, the British Library is another very good source, and I just mentioned the artwork, but there was also a writing by a Phoenician scholar named Sanchonathan that gave quite a bit of detail of this ancient family that I call the Cronites. Now, the Cronites began in Tyre, and they began to expand their empire all over the world, starting in Crete and Italy, in Greece and Egypt and ancient Babylon, and so on. This bloodline, which I call the Cronite bloodline, entails many stories of calculated murder, calculated breeding, calculated alliances, and so forth that allowed them to move into a position of global power. But there are some strange details of objects that this family had that will be discussed later that seem to help them move into this position of power as well. Now, the scholar Diodorus Siculus refers to these ancient Cronites as Atlanteans, and initially their social structure was a matriarchy. Their names will vary from culture to culture, but it is the same people. It is proven out in many of these writings of these ancient scholars that I mentioned. I will mainly use their Greek names as a key throughout this film, but I will also attempt to identify their counterparts in each culture that I cover. Now, this family started off with a great queen, and the Greeks call her Chaos, and they call her husband the Abyss. They were the leaders, rather she was, and she had many children, and around the 4th generation, she had a great-grandson named Uranus, and Uranus was a violent man. He had many children with many women. One of his main wives was his sister wife, Gaia. After a certain point, she had had enough of his behavior and attempted to separate from him, but was unable to because he was violent and controlling. He threatened her and her children often. When his son Cronus grew up, he decided to end the terror of his father. He ended up killing him, and the story goes, castrated him by the water. Now, Cronus moved into a position of rulership after this, and he was a quite violent man because of the times. And he ruled by fear and violence. Now, he did have allies with his other brothers. His closest one was Iapetus, which also goes by the name of Atlas. The two plotted against another brother, Hyperion, who was moving into a position of power because the people liked Hyperion. So they killed this brother and his son and caused the death of the daughter too. And the wife of Hyperion went crazy. Now, she was known as Basilia, And this Titaness moved out of the area and established a cult for her goddess name, Basilia. Sometimes she's known as Sibyl. Those two that name gets confused with Rhea as well. But Cronus moved into this position of power, and to maintain it, he came up with a strange way to control people, and that was the human sacrifice of his children, and probably after a certain point, other people's children. It was said that people couldn't understand him, but they feared him. So because of these rituals that he created, he was never challenged. His sister wife, Rhea, had children by him, and he ended up killing one of them, the one known as Pluto or Hades. Generally, this god is never shown with children because he was killed as a child, but he is known as the god of the underworld. Because of this, Rhea hid her other children. She hid Zeus on Crete and Poseidon on Rhodes Island. Now she also had girls with him, but it's not said in mythology where she hid them or not. Now Cronus also had a half-sister named Ashtaroth that he had many children with as well. Ashtaroth went along with his religious ceremonies, if you will, of human sacrifice, whereas Rhea did not. When Zeus grew up, he ended up taking over the rulership of this empire from his father, and he wasn't like him at all. In fact, he was the exact opposite. He was very kind, well-liked, and wanted to end these bizarre rituals. But it was a challenge because the followers of Cronus, named Elohim, or the Els, would not give up those ways. One of the weak points of Zeus was that he had many consorts and many children. But perhaps this was his way of creating a better world to spread his seed and his beliefs amongst the planet. It's hard to say, but I would tend to lean that way. Now, when Zeus had a child with Persephone, that child's name was Zagreus, but Persephone was his daughter, and that was a no-no. And he had a other sister wife named Hera who didn't like that, and also was jealous of all of his children because she wanted her children to inherit this empire rather than somebody else's children. Now it was said that Hera plotted with the Titans to get rid of Zagreus, and at one point these Titans, several of them, snuck in and killed this toddler and mutilated him and cannibalized him and left only the heart. Upon discovery of this, Zeus went insane. He kept the heart. He made a potion vowing to reincarnate Zagreus. When a maiden by the name of Semele was found, he either drank that potion or gave it to her before he impregnated her. The birth of that child was a boy who became known as Dionysus. Now Dionysus is also Osiris and many other names. Proof of that comes from Diodorus Siculus' The Library of History. He writes, "And of the ancient Greek writers of mythology, some give to Osiris the name Dionysus, or with a slight change in form, Sirius. One of them, Eumpalus, in his Bacchic hymn speaks of our Dionysus, shining like a star with fiery eye in every ray." Osiris was the first they record to make mankind give up cannibalism, for after Isis did discover the fruit of both wheat and barley which grew wild over the land, along with the other plants, but was still unknown to man, and Osiris had also devised the cultivation of these fruits, all men were glad to change their food, both because of the pleasing nature of the newly discovered grains, and because it seemed to their advantage to refrain from their butchery of one another. As proof of the discovery of these fruits, they offer the following ancient custom which they still observe. Even yet at harvest time, the people make a dedication of the first heads of the grain to be cut, and standing beside the sheaf beat themselves and call upon Isis by the act, rendering honor to the goddess for the fruits which she discovered at the season when she first did this. Moreover, in some cities during the festival of Isis as well, stalks of wheat and barley are carried among the other objects in the procession, as a memorial of what the goddess so ingeniously discovered at the beginning. Isis also established laws, they say, in accordance with which the people regularly dispense justice to one another, and are let to refrain through fear of punishment from illegal violence and insolence. And it is for this reason also that the early Greeks gave Demeter the name Thesmophorus, acknowledging in this way that she had first established their laws. Okay, now there is also a timeline in these ancient books, which I found in Diodorus Siculus' The Library of History as well. He writes, the number of years from Osiris and Isis, they say, to the reign of Alexander, who founded the city which bears his name in Egypt, is over 10,000, but according to other writers, a little less than 23,000. Okay, so now Alexander the Great reigned about 2,300 years ago, and that would put this time period between 12,000 to 25,000 years ago, which also fits in to an Egyptian scholar named Manetho's timeline. So now that I've showed you the beginnings of these connections, which I term my mythological unification theory, we can start to put the pieces together of this puzzle that has been hidden from us. Now, I would like to also prove that the Nordic gods are also the Greek gods. Snorri Sturluson wrote in his Hemskringla the following: Othin died in his bed in Sweden, but when he felt death approaching, he had himself marked with the point of a spear, and he declared as his own all men who fell in battle. He said he was about to depart to the abode of the gods and would there welcome his friends. So then the Swedes believed that he had gone to the old Asgarth and would live there forever. Then the belief in Othin arose anew, and they called on him. Often the Swedes thought he revealed himself before great battles were fought, when he would give victory to some and invite others to come to his abode. Both fates seemed good to them. Othin was burned after his death, and this burning on the pyre of his body took place with great splendor. It was people's belief that the higher the smoke rose into the sky, the more elevated in heaven would he be who was cremated, and therefore a man was considered the nobler the more possessions were burned with him. After him, north of Notan took power among the Swedes and continued the sacrifices. Okay, continuing on with Snorri Sturluson's work in the Prose Edda, the Giffagonin, he writes, Next, they made for themselves in the middle of the world a city which is called Asgard. Men call it Troy. Now, Troy is an ancient Greek city that is in modern-day Turkey. I have just now connected Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and Nordic religions to connect it with Hinduism, because I believe that Dionysus Osiris is also Krishna. There are many writings that describe his wars and triumphs in India. Here is a mosaic of Dionysus fighting the Indians in the Palazzo Massimo at Rome. A book written by Cronus called the Dionysica gives quite a bit of detail of the stories of Dionysus and the Indians. Diodorus Siculus' The Library of History also gives quite a bit of information as well. For example, he writes, Osiris also took an interest in hunting elephants, and everywhere left behind him inscribed pillars telling of his campaign. And he visited all the other nations of Asia as well, and crossed into Europe at the Hellespont. Diodorus Siculus also writes, he also founded not a few cities in India, one of which he named Nisa, wishing to leave there a memorial of the city in Egypt where he had been reared. He also planted ivy in the Indian Nisa, and throughout India and those countries which border upon it, the plant to this day is still to be found only in this region, and many other signs of his stay he left in that country, which have led the Indians of a later time to lay claim to the god and say that he was by birth a native of India. Okay, now there's also some issues with the timeline of these people that are explained by Diodorus Siculus's Library of History as well. For example, there are many people during the time of the Trojan War, which appears to have only been several thousand years ago, that claim direct descent from gods and goddesses. But perhaps it wasn't direct, but some sort of familial line that they could make these claims. In the Library of History, Diodorus Siculus writes, the account of the Egyptians agrees also with the tradition which has been handed down among the Greeks since very early times, to the effect that Heracles cleared the earth of wild beasts, a story which is in no way suitable for a man who lived in approximately the period of the Trojan War, when most parts of the inhabited world had already been reclaimed from their wild state by agriculture and over the land. Accordingly, this reclamation of the land suits better a man who lived in early times, when men were still held in subjection by the vast numbers of wild beasts, a state of affairs which was especially true in the case of Egypt, the upper part of which is to this day desert and infested with wild beasts. Now I have connected Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Nordic, and Hinduism, as well as all Semitic religions, to this ancient family. But who is Satan? And there are many references in these ancient books that give the information. But they go by different names of this Satan. It is basically spelled out through the occultist Helen Blavatsky in her Secret Doctrine, Volume 2, who this Satan is. And here's what she wrote. Hence the allegory of Prometheus, who steals the divine fire, so as to allow men to proceed consciously on the path of spiritual evolution, thus transforming the most perfect of animals on earth into a potential god, and making him free to take the kingdom of heaven by violence. Hence also the curse pronounced by Zeus against Prometheus, and by Jehovah El Debaoth against his rebellious son Satan. It is furthermore revealed in these ancient books that Prometheus had a kingdom in Egypt. He went by the name Set. He was red-haired, and he contrived and participated in the murder of Dionysus Osiris and was cursed by Zeus for doing this. Now I want to read something from Diodorus Siculus's The Library of History again. He writes, while Osiris and his army were thus employed, the Nile, they say, at the time of the rising of Sirius, which is the season when the river is usually at flood, breaking out of its banks, inundated at a large section of Egypt, and covered especially that part where Prometheus was governor. And since practically everything in the district was destroyed, Prometheus was so grieved that he was on the point of quitting life willfully. Because its water sweeps down so swiftly and with such violence, the river was given the name Attis. But Heracles, being ever intent upon great enterprises and eager for the reputation of a manly spirit, speedily stopped the flood at its breach and turned the river back into its former course. Consequently, certain of the Greek poets worked the incident into a myth, to with effect that Heracles had killed the eagle which was devouring the liver of Prometheus. Now, the point of reading that is to show you that in these ancient works, the names of these gods and goddesses vary. Here, I've just pointed out that Prometheus was in Egypt, and I proved through other esoteric writings that he is the equivalent of Set or Satan. More of this information can be read in my books and videos online, but I think for the purposes of this movie, this should be enough. Now, I want to point out again that Zeus had many bloodlines from the children that he spawned, and I created a chart to show where they went. And as you can see, they went all over Europe and into the Middle East, into northern Africa, up into the area of Russia, into India. But I don't believe that's the only place that these Cronites went. I also believe that not only did the Cronites travel, but so did other Phoenicians, because the Phoenicians were their people. I believe that this entire family traveled the entire world as is stated in these books. One bloodline taught good ways of agriculture and remembering the gods and goddesses through flowers and food offering. The other side of the family taught bad ways, and that was through human sacrifice rituals that came from Cronus, which were carried on by these Phoenicians. I believe evidence of this is all over the world, particularly in Ireland, when the stories of the Fomorians tell of how they enslaved the Numidians and forced them to not only give quite a bit of their fruits of their labors through the crops and milk that they had harvested, but they also had required 2/3 of their children be human sacrificed during the time of famine. The Tuatha De Danann came in and helped the Numidians defeat these Fomorians, and a queen, which was the equivalent of Athena, took over rulership of Ireland. Now, this queen was also known as Bridget. And as I said, this bloodline of Zeus traveled all over and created hereditary bloodlines. And they were given their instructions on how to rule and take care of the people. If they were not a good king or queen, they were removed. Now, I know that this bloodline was all over Europe and northern Africa, the Middle East, and India, but I also believe it went into China through the stories of the Jade Emperor. I believe that Zeus was there teaching the people certain cults. But I also believe, as I said, both sides of the family made it over to the Americas. I believe the proof is in the ancient petroglyphs and artifacts that were taken out of the mounds. The mounds are not unique to the Americas. In fact, the mounds are European in origin. Mounds are all over Europe. In fact, there is a tapestry that shows Caucasoids building mounds. I have yet to see a Native American petroglyph or indication of Siberians building those mounds. Further evidence is given in petroglyphs all over the Southwest and artifacts from the Mississippian culture. The Mississippian culture is mysterious. However, upon closer examination, one can begin to see the connections with this culture and the Middle East. Specifically, the motif of the eye in the hand matches the Hamza of the Middle East, and it is a symbol of Ashtaroth, who also goes by the name of Tanit. Also, the spiral motif is quite common all over the Americas, which is very common in Ireland and Nordic petroglyphs. Of particular interest to me were stone effigies of a man and a woman that were pulled out of the Etowah mounds in Georgia. Upon closer inspection, one can see that the female effigy is red-headed. The male effigy has dark hair but red ears. I believe the significance of these effigies is the following. These Caucasoid people, who mainly had red and blonde hair, traveled the world. In some cases, they were able to get along with other tribes that came in. In other cases, they were at warfare with them. To stop this warfare, they had to interbreed with them, and often that would include giving a red-haired woman to one of the chiefs of this Siberian or darker-skinned tribe, or Polynesian tribe, producing a mixed raced child who would become the chief or ruler bloodline of this group. This was done in New Zealand. The stories of the red-headed and blonde-haired fairy people are becoming known again. It was thought that these people were gone until a woman came out and said that she was a descendant of these red-haired people, and many of her children and grandchildren had red hair as well, and her genetics proved that she was related to possibly red-haired people in Peru, and that bloodline went back to ancient Iraq. I believe that this bloodline of Caucasoids traveled the world and had to either fight to survive. In most cases, they didn't win, or they had to interbreed with other people in order to have peace. The stories out of Lovelock Cave of red-haired giants clearly indicate what happened to this red-haired tribe when they refused to integrate with the Siberian Paiute. After 3 years of warfare, they were exterminated. Their history and their identity, in my opinion, is being hidden. Many of those skeletal remains that were removed from that cave have disappeared and been destroyed. Furthermore, ancient stories and ancient writings confirm that there were Caucasoid people all over the Americas. For example, Lucy Thompson, a Yurok woman, wrote in her book, "To the American Indian, Reminiscences of a Yurok Woman," she writes, "When the Indians first made their appearance on the Klamath River, it was already inhabited by a white race of people, known among us as the Wagas. These white people were found to inhabit the whole continent and were a highly moral and civilized race. They heartily welcomed the Indians to their country and taught us all their arts and sciences. The Indians recognized the rights of these ancient people as the first possessors of the soil, and no difficulties ever arose between the two people. Their hospitality was exceedingly generous in the welfare of our people, and all prospered together in peace and happiness in their pursuit of human existence. After a time, there were intermarriages between the two races, but these were never promiscuous. For a vast period of time, the two races dwelt together in peace and honored homes. Wars and quarrels were unknown in this golden age of happiness. No depredations were ever committed upon the property of their people, as the white people were ruled with beacon light of kindness. And our people still worship the hallowed places where once they trod. Their morals were far superior to the white people of today. Their ideals were high and inspired our people with greatness. After we had lived with these ancient people so long, they suddenly called their hosts together and mysteriously disappeared for a distant land we know not where. Now I'm also going to skip ahead. She writes a little bit more. She says, when the Wagas first arrived on this continent, they handed down the traditions to us that it was inhabited by a giant race of people when they first came. These giants were represented by the Wagas as being very swarthy in complexion. And they used implements so large that no ordinary man could lift them. It was an age when large animals roamed the earth, and it seemed the birds and fowls were all very large in size. It appeared to be the first age, and was the age of the giants. The recollections transmitted by the Wagas were that these giants were very cruel and wicked. It was said that God became displeased with them and destroyed them, and they all perished from the earth. It was also said that God appeared to the high priest of the Wagas and told them he was going to destroy the giant race, and that the Wagas themselves would survive upon the earth as a new people. Smaller birds and animals would appear upon the earth for the use of man. Thus, the age of giants perished, but the Wagas do not hand down any tradition of how they perished from the earth, as my people have no recollections of ever seeing giants. Now, what Lucy Thompson just admitted was that there was a race of giants on the earth, including the Americas, before this white race came to the Americas, which came before her people came to the Americas. So here we have another oral and written tradition of white people that were all over the world. Now, what she did admit is that eventually they interbred with her tribe, which was Siberian, and that these white people disappeared. Personally, I believe they were bred out. Possibly some of them left. But I also believe there was extensive warfare all over the Americas between these newly arriving Siberians and the existing white people, possibly even some existing giants that were left. This has been proven out through the work of an anthropologist out of Arizona named Dr. Christy Turner. He studied the Anasazi and other sites in the Southwest and found extensive evidence of warfare and cannibalism. The red-haired people of Lovelock Cave were accused of being cannibals, and there was some evidence on only 3 bones of cannibalism. However, they were at war with the Paiute, and this could have been something that was an act of war. But the work of Dr. Christy Turner shows extensive amounts of cannibalism throughout the Southwest and extensive violent warfare. Now, Dr. Christy Turner's work wasn't well received, but he pretty much stuck to his guns and stood up to the gatekeepers, and he proved this out through the anthropological evidence that he found. And he wrote about it in a book called Man-Corn. So, in my opinion, a lot has been destroyed and covered up, and there was this race of giant people that the earth was a different place, and the animals were different and larger. Something happened to this planet that made everything change, and everything on it became smaller. All myths and legends and folklore and even religion hints at this or directly states it. What happened on this planet, we don't quite know. But the myths of Atlantis give us a clue. Now it is said that these people were quite advanced, but they misused their technology, and they created a cataclysm on this earth. In fact, they created 3 cataclysms. And all of the people had to start over. Based on my research, I believe that the events in Atlantis changed everything on this planet and changed the size of everything on this planet. Now, how do we connect some further esoteric religion to these ancient myths? And we do that through exposure of the Watchers. Now, the Book of Enoch describes several Watchers that were cursed because they taught mankind certain arts that were forbidden, which included writing and warfare and language and use of makeup and herbs. But they also interbred with regular humans, and that was the biggest sin of all. But who were these Watchers? Well, there are many clues that come from this Loeb library and other writings. For example, The History of the Ancient World by Sanchonathan gives us a clue. He writes, "But the auxiliaries of Elis, who is Cronus, were called Elohim, as it were, the allies of Cronus. They were so called after Cronus. And Cronus, having a son called Seditus, dispatched him with his own sword, because he held him in suspicion, and with his own hand deprived his son of life. And in like manner he cut off the head of his own daughter, so that all the gods were amazed at the mind of Cronus." Now we'll continue on and read you something from Diodorus Siculus' The Library of History, which tells us who the god was that created astrology. Here's what he wrote. "After the death of Hyperion, the myth relates, the kingdom was divided among the sons of Uranus, the most renowned of whom were Atlas and Cronus. Of those sons, Atlas received as his part the regions on the coast of the ocean, and he not only gave the name of Atlanteans to his peoples, but likewise called the greatest mountain in the land Atlas. They also say that he perfected the science of astrology and was the first to publish to mankind the doctrine of the sphere. And it was for this reason that the idea was held that the entire heavens were supported upon the shoulders of Atlas, the myth darkly hinting in the way at his discovery and description of the sphere." Now, if you go into the writings of the Book of Enoch, you'll find out that the fallen angel Barakwel is the one that taught astrology. Thus, Barakwel is equivalent to the Greek Iapetus, who also goes by the name Atlas at times. I've also just shown you that the Elohim were the followers of Cronus, and if you angered him, he killed you. Now, this film has given you a brief amount of information to help you put this puzzle together quickly. There is quite a bit more written in these ancient books out of the libraries that I have mentioned that fill in even more detail of this ancient world. However, at this point, it should be obvious that a great fraud has been committed upon the human race as to the history of this planet and the identity of these gods, goddesses, and this Semitic god. I have also proven out through my work that the Gnostic demiurge is Cronus. Now, from the Nag Hammadi library, the hypostasis of the archons, I would like to show you that the demiurge is Cronus. Here is what is written. This ruler, by being androgynous, made himself a vast realm, in an extent without limit. And he contemplated creating offspring for himself, and created for himself 7 offspring, androgynous, just like their parent. And he said to his offspring, "It is I who am God of the entirety." And Zoe, the daughter of Pistis Sophia, cried out and said to him, "You are mistaken, Sakla," for which the alternative name is Yaldabaoth. She breathed into his face, and her breath became a fiery angel for her. And that angel bound Yaldabaoth and cast him down into Tartarus below the abyss. Now when his offspring Sabaoth saw the force of that angel, he repented and condemned his father and his mother Matter. He loathed her, but he sang songs of praise up to Sophia and her daughter Zoe. And Sophia and Zoe caught him up and gave him charge of the 7th heaven below the veil, between above and below. And he is called God of the forces, Sabaoth, since he is up above the forces of chaos, for Sophia established him. Okay, so now that should be clear to you that they actually said it was Tartarus that Yaldabaoth was cast into, and that his son Sabaoth took over after he was gone, which is the same story as Cronus being cast into Tartarus and Zeus taking over. One very curious writing from this Nag Hammadi library from the Apocryphon of John describes these ancient gods and goddesses of having to change their form or image to mate with the daughters of men. Here's what is written. And he made a plan with his powers. He sent his angels to the daughters of men that they might take some of them for themselves and raise offspring for their enjoyment. And at first they did not succeed. When they had no success, they gathered together again, and they made a plan together. They created a counterfeit spirit who resembles the spirit who had descended, so as to pollute the souls through it. And the angels changed themselves in their likeness into the likeness of the daughters of men, mates, filling them with the spirit of darkness, which they had mixed for them with evil. They brought gold and silver and a gift and copper and iron and metal and all kinds of things, and they steered the people who had followed them into great troubles by leading them astray with many deceptions. They, the people, became old without having enjoyment. They died, not having found truth and without knowing the God of truth. And thus the whole creation became enslaved forever, from the foundation of the world until now. And they took women and begot children out of the darkness, according to the likeness of their spirit. And they closed their hearts, and they hardened themselves throughout the hardness of the counterfeit spirit until now. Now I could continue on and show you that in the book of Enoch, these angels are always described as snow white. and that they could appear as men if they so chose to do so. For example, the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha by James H. Charlesworth. He writes, "And I saw countless angels, 100,000 times 100,000, 10 million times, 10 million encircling that house. Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, Phanuel, and numerous other holy angels that are in heaven above go in and out of that house. Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, Phanuel, and numerous other holy angels that are countless. With them is the antecedent of time. His head is white and pure like wool, and his garment is indescribable. I fell on my face, my whole body mollified, and my spirit transformed." Here's another passage from the Old Testament Pseudepigrapha. He writes, "And they lifted me into one place where there were the ones like the flaming fire, and when they so desire, they appear like men. And they took me into a place of whirlwind in the mountain. The top of its summit was reaching into heaven." Okay, these are from the book of Enoch, out of this Pseudepigrapha. And Enoch goes on to describe his visit with these angels after they take him up into the skies and travel out into space and across the earth. Going back into mythology, as I had mentioned earlier in this film, there were certain objects that these Cronites had that gave them power. One of them was the Tablet of Destinies that the Sumerian goddess Tiamat had. After her husband was killed, she gave this Tablet of Destinies to Kingu, her son, and went to war with Anu. Now she was killed, and he killed Kingu and took that Tablet of Destinies, and it gave him power. And I believe that Tablet of Destinies transferred down to El, or Elel, which would be the equivalent of Cronus, and down to Enki. Enki is the equivalent of Zeus. But there is also another object that is cited, and it is called the sacred Mies. And these Mies were kept in a boat of heaven by Enki. And the Mies were used to give information. They could build civilizations with the knowledge on these Mies. Now, Ishtar, or Inanna, is the equivalent of the Greek Aphrodite, and she created a civilization out of ancient Sumer. She received some of these sacred Mies from her father, Enki, who then had second thoughts about doing so, but he was unable to retrieve them and thus allowed her to keep them. She gave them to her priest and was able to create an advanced civilization through the knowledge on these sacred Mies. What were these objects that were coveted and gave knowledge and power? We don't know. But based on their description, they sure sound like some sort of ancient computer device that had knowledge on it. What I find interesting in Semitic religion is the mention of the Ark of the Covenant and the ephod. The ephod was a device worn by the high priest when in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant. The high priest would dance around with this while wearing this ephod, and it would cause the voice of God to come through on the angels on the Ark of the Covenant. To me, this almost sounds like some sort of transmitter-receiver device. And I have to wonder if it was some sort of recovered technology that only the priests knew about and kept to themselves, while keeping the general populace in ignorance? I would believe it is. You know what I'm doing today? I'm recycling my old TVs. The old cubes with the controller, just like the ephod and the Ark of the Covenant. The black cubes. Because we went to a smaller size. Look at all these black cubes. And you know where I'm recycling them? On Cuba Road. Now isn't that interesting? The black cubes. So at this point, you should be able to conclude that there is a hidden human story on this planet, and that the mythologies, legends, and folklore in even religions across the planet describe it. Even though it is denied by mainstream scientists and priests alike, this history is undeniable. No matter how many books they burn and how hard they try and destroy evidence, this history won't go away. In fact, I believe it is coming back with a vengeance, and everything must be laid out on the table. It is my goal to help do that and to destroy the lies that have been placed upon us. For further information, you could get some of my books online and read further. I hope this has begun to open your mind to the hidden human story that is all around us, and especially the untold story of the Cronites. Thank you.